I never asked her name the first morning I saw her. Looking back, that was the moment everything started changing, though it would take me the better part of a year to understand it.
It was late April, and I'd been sent down to the creek that bordered the south pasture to fill 4 water barrels for the bunkhouse on account of the well pump had thrown a rod, and Otis Latimer wasn't about to pay a blacksmith's rate to fix it before shearing season. I came around the cottonwoods expecting nothing but mud and minnows, and instead found a woman kneeling at the water's edge with a clay jug half filled and a length of rope tangled hopeless around her wrist, caught fast on a submerged root she couldn't see to work loose. She looked up at me with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, more like a woman calculating the fastest way out of a situation she hadn't chosen, and she said, plain as anything, in English cleaner than most of the ranch hands I worked beside, "I don't need your help." I stood there a good long moment feeling foolish, because I hadn't offered any yet, and because I'd been raised on stories about the Apache bands up in the hill country that made a man's hand go instinctively toward whatever tool was nearest, in this case an empty water barrel, which wasn't much use as a weapon and even less use as a peace offering. But something in her voice, some flat refusal to be a thing that needed saving, made me set the barrel down slow and crouch a respectful distance off instead of closer. "Didn't say you did," I told her. "Just didn't want to walk off and leave a person tangled in a root is all. Man feel poorly about that come supper." She didn't answer right off. She worked at the rope herself another minute, jaw set, until I could see her wrist starting to redden from the pulling, and only then did she nod once, sharp, granting permission rather than asking for aid. I waded in, cold as anything that time of year, snowmelt still working down from the mountains, and worked the rope free from the root without touching her, careful about that, because I understood even then that whatever trust existed between us was thinner than the ice still clinging to the shadowed banks upstream. If she'd told the men at her camp what had happened, or if word had somehow crossed to Otis Latimer that his newest hand had been standing chest deep in the South Creek freeing an Apache woman's wrist from a root, I believe I would have lost more than my job that spring. I would have lost the one thing that had kept me steady since my brother Daniel died. The idea that a man could still choose decency, even in a country that seemed built, timber by timber, to make choosing it as hard as possible. I was raised, same as most boys in that valley, on stories about the raids of years back, about my own uncle's cousin killed on the road to Tombstone, about a fear so old and so thoroughly stitched into the fabric of how we talked about the mountains that I'd never once stopped to ask whether the fear was earned by the people I was afraid of, or simply inherited the way you inherit a bad knee or a family grudge. Daniel had died in a skirmish with an Apache raiding party 3 years before I ever came to work the Latimer spread. Not shot, but thrown from a spooked horse during the chaos of it, which was its own particular cruelty, dying of something so ordinary in the middle of something so extraordinary. I carried that the way a man carries a stone in his boot, not always feeling it, but never quite forgetting it was there either. So when I say I didn't ask her name that first morning, understand that I mean I was afraid to. Afraid that giving her a name in my mind would make her a person instead of a shape I'd been taught to be wary of. And once she became a person, there'd be no going back to the simpler, meaner way of seeing the world I'd grown up inside of. I saw her again a week later, same stretch of creek, gathering the tender green shoots that grew along the bank in a woven basket balanced against her hip. She didn't speak to me, and I didn't speak to her, though I made a point of filling my barrels a good 30 feet upstream so as not to crowd whatever peace she'd made with that particular bend of water. It was the 3rd week, I believe, when she finally broke the silence herself, asking, without preamble, whether the ranch's cattle had been getting into the upper meadow again because her people's horses needed that grazing, and there'd been trouble the autumn before about whose stock belonged where. I told her I'd speak to Latimer about moving the fence line, though I already suspected what his answer would be. She looked at me a long moment, dark eyes taking my measure the way you'd take the measure of a horse you weren't sure you trusted yet, and said, "You're the first of his men who said he'd try, instead of saying it wasn't his business." That was the first real conversation between us, standing 20 feet apart across cold spring water, and it planted something in me I didn't have a name for yet either. The days that followed taught me things about that stretch of country I hadn't thought to ask before. I learned, without ever meaning to become a student of it, that the reservation boundary line running along the ridge above the creek had been redrawn by survey crews only 4 years earlier, cutting off nearly a third of what had once been open grazing land for her people's horses, land the government maps now called Latimer Range, though no fence had ever actually gone up to mark the difference. I learned that the beef ration promised to her band twice a month by the agency office in town arrived, more often than not, a week late and short by a head or two, and that the difference between a hard winter and a survivable one for people I'd never met before that April often came down to whether some clerk 200 miles off had signed the right requisition form on time. None of that was information I went looking for. It came to me sideways, the way most true things about a place come to a person who's finally willing to listen instead of assume. And by the middle of May, I found myself doing arithmetic in my head I'd never once bothered with before. Counting cattle Latimer let graze fat and easy on grass that used to belong, by treaty if not by any fence, to families going hungry 2 miles the other side of a line some surveyor had drawn without ever once setting foot on the ground he was dividing. I didn't say any of that to her. Not yet. It felt presumptuous. A white rancher's hand lecturing an Apache woman about her own people's hardship as though she hadn't lived every day of it longer and closer than I ever could from the outside. Instead, I did the only thing that felt honest, which was to keep showing up at the creek, keep listening more than I talked, and let whatever trust wanted to grow between us grow at whatever pace it needed, without my rushing it or naming it before it was ready to be named. By early summer, we had fallen into an unspoken rhythm neither of us discussed aloud. I'd come to the creek most mornings under one excuse or another: barrels needed filling, a stray calf needing hunting, a fence post needing checking that could just as easily have waited a week, and more often than not, I'd find her there too, and we'd talk. Small things at first. She told me the names of the plants growing along the bank, which ones eased a fever, and which ones a careless child shouldn't chew on. She showed me once how to read the color of the water itself for warning of a flash flood building somewhere up in the hills long before any cloud showed over the ridge, a skill she said her grandmother had taught her the same way it had been taught for longer than either of us could count backward. I found myself some mornings inventing reasons to linger past what any actual ranch chore required, and I suspect she did the same, though neither of us said so plainly for a long while yet. I told her about my brother Daniel, the first time I'd spoken his name aloud to anyone since the funeral, and I watched her face carefully as I did, half expecting some flicker of satisfaction or vindication, and finding instead only a quiet, steady sorrow, the kind one grieving person offers another without needing to be asked. "My mother's brother died the same year," she told me. "Soldiers, not a raid. There's grief on both sides of every fence line in this country, Jesse. Most folks only ever learn to count their own." I asked her name that day, finally, 3 months late by my own reckoning. She told me, Sela, and told me she was the daughter of a man named Taji, who led what remained of their band on land the government had drawn shrinking lines around every few years since before she was born. She told me about the reservation boundary, redrawn twice already in her lifetime, and about the Indian agent, a thin, careful man named Reeves, who came twice a year with a ledger book and a list of rules that seemed to multiply faster than the beef rations that were supposed to accompany them. I understood, hearing her talk, that the creek where we met wasn't neutral ground the way I'd been telling myself it was. It sat close enough to the edge of the reservation boundary that her presence there was, technically, already a small act of defiance. Grazing rights and water rights that existed since before either of our families arrived in that valley, now requiring a kind of careful permission that changed with every new agent's mood. The first emotional peak of that summer came on a hot afternoon in July when I rode down to the creek to find Seela crouched over her younger brother, a boy no older than 10, his leg bent wrong beneath him from a fall from the rocks upstream. She was steady, giving him instructions in their own language in a voice that never once cracked, but I could see her hand shaking as she worked, and I understood that even the steadiest people have a limit to what they can carry alone. I splinted the leg with 2 straight branches and strips torn from my own shirt, the way I'd learned doing the same for calves born wrong on the Latimer spread, and I carried the boy myself the better part of 2 miles to where her camp waited, because her people's own healer had traveled north for the season, and there was no faster way to get him help. Word of that reached Otis Latimer within the week, the way word travels in a valley too small to keep secrets in.
I stayed at her family's camp longer than I probably should have that afternoon, waiting to see the boys settled and breathing easy before I'd let myself leave. It was the first time I'd properly seen the inside of their world, rather than just the creek's edge of it. Brush shelters set in a loose circle, dogs underfoot, an older woman who I later learned was Seela's aunt watching me the whole while, with an expression that made plain I was a guest tolerated rather than welcomed, and Seela's father, Taji, standing a little apart, arms crossed, saying nothing to me directly, but watching everything. He was a broad, quiet man with more gray in his hair than I'd expected, and when he finally did speak, it was only to Seela, in their own language, low enough that I couldn't have followed even if I'd understood the words. "What did he say?" I asked her afterward, walking back toward where I'd left my horse. She said he asked why a Latimer man carried his son 2 miles on his own horse instead of sending someone else to fetch help. I told him you didn't stop to think about whose horse it was. He said that was either very foolish or very rare, and he hadn't decided which yet. I laughed despite myself, tired and sun-worn and still a little shaken from the boys' cries when I'd set the splint. "Which do you think it was?" She considered that a long moment, walking beside me in the fading gold light. "I think most men stop to think about whose horse it is before they think about a boy's leg. You didn't. I noticed that back in April, too, with the rope." Otis Latimer called me into the ranch house within the week, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't offer to share, and told me plain that carrying an Apache boy through open country on a Latimer horse was the kind of thing that could get a man's job ended, or worse, depending on who happened to be riding the road that same afternoon and what conclusions they jumped to. "I didn't do it for trouble," I told him. "I did it because a boy's leg was broke and I was closest." "Doesn't matter what you did it for, Jesse," Latimer said. "Matters what it looks like. And out here, what a thing looks like is most of what gets a man killed." I opened my mouth to tell him something true and important then, that I'd come to know Seela over 3 months of quiet mornings at the creek, that I didn't see her the way he saw her people, that the fear I'd been raised on had started, slow and unwilling, to come apart in my hands the way old rope comes apart when you finally stop needing it to hold anything together. But the words I had been building all summer without realizing it simply would not come. Not in that ranch house, not to that man, and I said nothing at all.
and I have wondered ever since what might have gone differently if I'd found the courage that afternoon instead of 3 seasons later. Autumn brought the dark turn. A string of cattle went missing from the Latimer herd, 6 head, driven off in the night from the upper pasture, the same pasture Selah's people's horses had been grazing since the fence dispute I'd never managed to settle in spring. Latimer didn't wait for evidence. He rode into town and came back with 4 other ranchers and a deputy, all of them certain the theft could only mean one thing, all of them ready to ride out to the reservation boundary and demand answers with more force than the situation called for. I rode with them, not because I believed what they believed, but because I was afraid of what might happen if I wasn't there to slow things down, and because I did not yet have the courage to simply refuse and stay behind, which shames me still when I think on it honestly. The ride out took the better part of a morning. 5 men and myself, moving fast along the boundary road, with the kind of grim, righteous energy that spreads through a group of frightened men faster than any actual evidence ever could. I remember the deputy checking his revolver twice before we'd even cleared the Latimer gate, and one of the other ranchers, a man named Petz I barely knew, talking the whole way about what he'd heard from his own grandfather about the raids of the 70s, stories that had nothing to do with 6 missing steers, but everything to do with the fear riding alongside us that morning like an uninvited 6th man in the party. I kept my mouth shut and my eyes on the road, telling myself I was there to keep things from going too far, though even then I understood that a man's silence in a moment like that is its own kind of participation, not the neutral thing I wanted it to be. We found the cattle 2 miles past the boundary line, not driven there by any hand from Selah's camp, but scattered by a spring flash flood that had washed out a stretch of fence 3 weeks back, fence Latimer himself had been too tight-fisted to repair, choosing instead to blame a theft that had never happened rather than admit his own neglect had let 6 head wander loose into open country. But by the time that truth surfaced, the damage to trust between the ranch and the reservation had already been done. Agent Reeves used the incident as justification to tighten the boundary further, restricting movement along the very stretch of creek where Selah and I had built whatever fragile thing existed between us, and for 3 long weeks in October I did not see her at all. And I understood, with a hollow feeling I recognized from the week Daniel died, what it was to lose something before you'd ever properly named it as yours to lose. I went looking for her anyway, the last week of October, riding out past the boundary marker for the first time without any excuse of barrels or fences to hide behind, only the plain truth that I needed to see her, and had run out of patience for pretending otherwise. I found her at the edge of her family's camp, gathering firewood in the cold, and when she saw me, her face went through something complicated. Relief and anger, both, I think, in roughly equal measure. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Reeves has men watching the boundary now after the cattle business. If they see a Latimer hand out here—" "I don't work for what Latimer believes," I said. "I work for wages. What I believe is my own business, and I've spent all autumn deciding what that is." She set down the wood she was carrying, slow, and looked at me a long moment in the gray afternoon light. "And what have you decided?" I opened my mouth again, the way I had in Latimer's ranch house months before, and this time the words did come, though they came out rougher and less certain than I'd rehearsed them in my head across all those long, silent weeks. I told her that the fear I'd carried since Daniel died had never once made me safer, only smaller, and that watching her steady hands splint her brother's leg back in July taught me more about courage than any story I'd been told growing up about the dangers of the mountains. I told her I didn't know what to call what I felt for her, only that it had grown steadier through every season we'd shared that creek, and losing 3 weeks of her company in October taught me it wasn't a small thing I could simply set down and walk away from. She didn't answer right away, and I understood, watching her, that whatever she said next mattered more than anything either of us had said across that whole long year. My father has already had 2 conversations with Agent Reeves about a Latimer man seen too often near our camp, she said finally. He doesn't know it's you specifically, not yet. But if he learns the truth of what's grown here, and if it goes wrong for either of us, I won't be the reason your name gets added to whatever list men like Reeves keep for people like you who cross lines they weren't supposed to cross. And if it goes right? She almost smiled then, the closest I'd seen to it in 3 weeks. Then I suppose we'll have 4 seasons behind us, and no good reason left to stop at 3 more. The revelation that turned everything came in early November when Sela's father, Taji, requested a formal meeting with Agent Reeves regarding the cattle dispute, insisting on bringing witnesses who could speak to the true cause of the missing herd, the washed-out fence, the flood, the neglect Latimer had tried to bury under an accusation instead. The meeting was held in the agency office in town, a cramped room with a single stove and a wall of filing cabinets that seemed to represent, in their sheer bureaucratic bulk, everything slow and grinding about how justice moved for people like Sela's family in that territory. Taji sat straight-backed through the whole of it, saying little, letting the evidence speak where his own voice, he seemed to understand, would carry less weight in that particular room no matter how true his words were. I testified at that meeting, the first time I had ever spoken up plainly against my own employer in front of men who held real power over my wages and my future in that valley. My hands shook some, standing there in front of Reeves's desk with Latimer glaring at me from across the room, but I made myself say it slow and clear anyway. I told Reeves and the assembled ranchers exactly what I had seen. A fence Latimer had let rot through 2 full seasons of warnings from his own hands, cattle that had wandered through the gap of their own accord, no theft, no raid, nothing but ordinary neglect dressed up as accusation, because accusation was easier to swallow than the truth of a rancher's own poor stewardship. I told him about the specific warning I'd given Latimer myself back in August, and how he'd waved it off as a job for after shearing that never came before the flood took the fence out entirely. And I told him, too, about the fence line dispute from the previous spring that had never been properly settled, the same neglect running clean through both seasons like a single unbroken thread. Latimer's face went the color of a bad sunburn as I spoke, and when I finished, he stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floorboards. This man's been sneaking out to that reservation all year, chasing after some girl. Ask him how impartial his testimony really is before you write any of it down, Reeves. The room went quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I felt Sela's eyes on me from where she sat beside her father, steady and unblinking, though I didn't dare look at her directly, not then, afraid that whatever passed between us in that glance would be plain to every man in the room. Reeves took off his spectacles, cleaned them slow and deliberate on his coat sleeve, and said, in the flattest voice I ever heard him use, "Mr. Latimer, whether this man is courting someone has no bearing on whether your fence was in disrepair. I have the warning he mentioned in writing, dated the 14th of August, in your own hand, acknowledging the section needed work. That is the only fact in front of me that matters today." Latimer had nothing to say back to that. He gathered his hat and left the room before the meeting had even properly closed, and I understood, watching him go, that whatever standing I'd once had in that valley had gone with him. It cost me the job. Latimer let me go that same week, calling me a man who'd forgotten which side of the fence he was hired to stand on, and telling the other hands, loud enough for me to hear on my way out, that he'd known since July I'd gone soft in the head over some Apache girl and should have cut me loose then, rather than let it fester into something that cost him standing with the other ranchers. I said nothing back to that. There wasn't a version of defending myself in that yard that wouldn't have proven his point better than my silence did. But the testimony also did something I hadn't expected. It moved Agent Reeves, careful bureaucratic man that he was, to reconsider the boundary restrictions he'd tightened in October, since the evidence no longer supported the fear that had justified them. Reeves came to find me himself, 2 days after the hearing, at the small room I'd taken over the feed store while I looked for new work. He didn't apologize exactly. I don't believe men in his position were much in the habit of it, but he told me, adjusting his spectacles in a way that seemed almost embarrassed, that testimony like mine was rarer than the job required it to be, and that he intended to note in his report that the boundary tightening had been based on an accusation the facts hadn't supported. It wasn't justice, not the whole of it, but it was more honesty from that office than I believe that valley had seen in some time, and I understood it as its own small kind of debt repaid. The creek reopened to shared use by the second week of November, cold and gray under the first real frost of the season, and I was there the morning it did, waiting, because I had nowhere else in that valley I wanted to be.
Winter settled deep and quiet after that. I found work with a smaller outfit 2 valleys over. Honest work that paid less but asked nothing of me that I couldn't square with what I'd come to believe. The new foreman there, a lean, quiet man named Osgood, never once asked why my last employer had let me go. And I came to understand that some men simply judge a hand by his work and let the rest of a man's business stay his own, which, after the Latimer spread, felt like its own kind of mercy. Sella and I met at the creek through the cold months whenever the weather allowed it, wrapped in enough wool and buffalo hide to withstand an hour or two of standing together in falling snow, talking about small things again the way we had that first spring, though everything underneath the small things had changed by then. It was the first hard freeze of December when I finally said the thing I'd been circling for the better part of a year. I told her that I understood what it might cost her, among her own people, with her father, with the whole careful architecture of a life lived under Reeves's ledger book and boundary lines, to be known as a woman who loved a white rancher's former hand. I told her I would understand if that cost was more than she was willing to carry, and that I would go on coming to the creek regardless, as a friend if nothing else, for as many seasons as she'd allow it.
She was quiet a long while, breath fogging in the cold air between us, and then she reached out and took my hand. Bare, ungloved, cold, the first time either of us had touched the other since I'd freed her wrist from that root 8 months before. I've spent a year deciding I don't much care what a ledger book has to say about who I'm allowed to love, she said. My grandmother wore this bracelet through 2 removals and 1 war, Jesse. She didn't survive all that, so her granddaughter could let a stranger's rules decide her heart for her. Taji found out about us properly that same winter, not through any confrontation, but through his own quiet observation, the way I imagine he'd learned most things worth knowing across a long, careful life. He came to the creek himself one gray afternoon in January, alone, no ceremony to it, and stood across the water from me the way his daughter had stood from me that first April morning, sizing me up in a silence I didn't dare interrupt. My daughter tells me you spoke against your own employer in a room full of men who could have made your life very hard for it. Yes, sir, I said, not knowing what else there was to say, my hands gone still and awkward at my sides, the way a man's hands go when he understands he is being weighed by someone whose judgment actually matters to him. And you did this before you knew whether it would change anything for her, or only cost you something for nothing. I didn't do it thinking about what it would earn me, I said. I did it because it was true. and because I'd stopped being able to live with myself if I let it go unsaid. He was quiet a long moment, watching the water move between us. "That is a rarer thing than courage," he said at last. "Most men are brave for a reward they've already pictured. Few are honest simply because the alternative had become unbearable. My daughter has always had a sharper eye for that difference than most people twice her age." He didn't offer his blessing outright, not that day, and I understood well enough not to ask for it before it was freely given. But he nodded once before he turned to go, the same sharp, economical nod his daughter had given me over a tangled rope 9 months before. And I understood it to mean something had shifted, slow and real, the way most true things in that valley seemed to shift, not all at once, but season by patient season. We didn't marry that winter, or even the one after. There were still boundaries to navigate, still a father to bring slowly around, still a valley full of people who would need a long season or 3 to unlearn what they'd been taught, same as I had. But we kept meeting at the creek through every season that followed, and somewhere along the way, the meeting itself stopped being a secret and started simply being our life. Water and seasons and 2 people who had learned the hard, patient way that trust built slow is the only kind that holds. There were harder days ahead than I've had room to tell here. A second cold winter that nearly took her youngest brother with the same fever that had once taken half a camp 2 valleys over. A spring when Reeves was replaced by an agent far less inclined towards honesty than his predecessor. A summer when Osgood's outfit nearly went under in a drought that tested every ounce of patience either of us had left. I don't tell those stories tonight because this one was never about the hardship alone. It was about the particular, stubborn, season-by-season work of 2 people deciding again and again that a line drawn on somebody else's map wasn't reason enough to stop showing up at the water. I think of that first April morning often, the rope tangled on the root, the flat certainty in her voice when she told me she didn't need my help. I have turned that memory over so many times since that its edges have gone smooth as a creek stone, the way any memory does when a person keeps returning to it not out of pain, but out of a kind of quiet gratitude. She was right in the way that mattered most. She never needed saving. What she needed, what we both needed, was someone willing to wade into cold water and stand there a while, not fixing anything, just present, until trust had time enough to grow the way things grow slow along a creek bank, the tender green shoots first, and then, given seasons enough, everything else. I did not understand that patience was itself a kind of courage until she taught me, without ever once meaning to teach me anything at all. She never asked me to stay that winter, or any winter after. She only made room beside her at the water's edge and left it there, waiting for as long as I cared to come.